Hey guys, welcome back, and in this video we are going to be painting the parrot. Why I chose the parrot to be specific is because the parrots, especially this reference, has different tones that are similar but quite different. What I mean by that is when you're looking at the actual bright vibrant yellow of the parrot's fur, the parrot's wings, feathers, yes, and you contrast them with the other aspects of the parrot's feathers, such as the turquoise blue that it has around its actual head and on the side of its actual wing. So to make things easier, I've already pre-mixed colors beforehand and sketched out the actual parrot, so to make the whole process easier when I start painting. So for now, what I first start off with is by applying the brightest area of color onto the parrot feathers, making things a lot more simple when you are adding simple colors and adding foundations onto the actual parrot to break down different sections of where the color comes from. Now, I don't know if you noticed that the color that I'm putting down is not as vibrant as the reference that is copied from, and that's only because, like I mentioned before, it's a layering process. We can always come back and improve. So right now, all I'm doing is just layering each and every section of the actual parrot to give me a lot more focus when I do dive in later on to refine things better. Now, when I'm mixing a bit of green for the top part of the parrot's forehead, I'm not necessarily concentrating on doing this as perfect as possible. As you can see, I'm just putting in a rough estimate of what it looks like, so that I can also come back to that section and refine that as I go along. So far so good. I like how the parrot is looking like right now. I tried to compare my painting technique to a coloring book, putting basic colors down first, then building the actual texture and building the actual foundation for what it would look like. When it comes to the beak, I add a simple black, but being careful not to overpaint areas that might bog down what it looks like and what is represented on the actual image. I get back to it and I single out areas that have a lot more detail to them, bringing them a lot more flesh and a lot more focus. Hence why I kind of slow down when I have to paint the detailed areas, because there is a bit of light hitting the parrot's beak when it's reflected in the sun. At this stage, I leave things as they are, but slowly just adding a bit of rendition onto the parrot's features, such as the eye, places around the eye, and the feathers that make up most of the detail surrounding the eye and the beak. Using a detailed brush, just getting these areas out of the way, focusing more on having an overall image rendered out, but not fully completed, and taking my time with each and every detail that makes up the parrot image, understanding that there are colors that go in between the feathers, but having a simple representation of what the parrot looks like at this point, and keeping things going as seamless as possible, but also not putting too much pressure on myself and actually painting this area of the parrot, and just keeping things a lot more calm and concise. I then go and add a bit of my middle grays that complete the parrot's beak, making things come together a bit more, and I add a couple of blues onto the gray that gives you a bit of character when you are painting the parrot's beak. So at this point, I'm also keeping aware of refining the subject a bit more, but also paying attention towards the reference that I am painting from. I realized that the parrot's feather has a bit of brown strokes and a bit of brown shadowy lines and transitions that give it a form of realism, because you could see that the parrot's image was taken within daytime and the sun was out, so the reddish hues represent the intense weather that the parrot was actually taken, and I try and paint that in as well, not necessarily painting it specifically as it was, but knowing that I can always come back and forth and refine things as we go along. I think this also builds a bit of character onto the actual painting, because you do not necessarily have to paint things as is, and that's why I prefer doing things from an instinctive point, but also keeping the actual reference as a source of inspiration that I could use to keep going. I then add on my detailing lines onto the actual wings, mixing a bit of black and blue to give that a bit of a shadowy effect going around the parrot's wings, and painting each and every line very carefully, but not overly focusing on them too much because they could differ from one another, giving them a bit of character. And continuing to the other areas of the actual painting, I make sure to focus on subtle detail to bring out the three-dimensional effect, to even convince the viewer of what they're looking at as a feather as opposed to a single part of the parrot. So as I'm painting, I remember that this wing has highlights. And because it has highlights, I know the highlights are a bit subtle, similar to what I did when I painted the shadows of the wings. Just added a bit of touches onto the wings, bring them out in a way that will look subtle but effective, and not putting way too much detail that will wash out the colors that I put earlier. And continuing with the top of the parrot's forehead close towards the beak, just adding a bit of highlights, a bit of whites, and a bit of the color hue that came before that, representing the actual picture as a whole. Right now, the image is looking a lot more tight and a lot more convincing and a lot more rendered than actual reference, and I prefer to keep it like this, keep it a bit stylistic. I remember that it has a background. Originally I wanted to leave it as is, but then I realized that it would be fun to implement a background that would look quite interesting from my idea and perspective. I first start from the shadow areas of the actual background. This section of the actual painting I enjoyed a lot more because it was a lot more free and not bogged down into as much detail as I was when actually painting the parrot subject. And I continued this as I go along. I went a bit back and forth with this process because I had to figure out which areas I'd like to keep while keeping this a bit stylistic and custom to what I wanted. And I decided that to use a palette knife just to keep things a bit more interesting when painting the background. As you can see, certain areas of this image is not rendered out exactly, but I kind of preferred the stylistic choice that I chose right here because it gives it a bit of personality when you are painting your own thing and differentiates a painting from an actual picture and gives it a bit of more character. I continue to add in the background a bit of shadowy transitions just to give that image a bit of depth, and I call it a day. So this is the parrot that we have so far. So far I like what I'm seeing and decided to leave it at this. If I wanted to continue, I can always come back and add a bit of line yellows, a bit of line greens and such to just bring a much more vibrant scene. But I decided to leave this as is, muted as is, to separate the subject from the foreground and to give a bit of depth on towards the painting. So yeah, there we have it. This is the parrot painting for now. And what I'd like you guys to do is paint a bird of your own choice, whether it's a parrot or an eagle. Post your progress onto the project exercise so we can all see and have a look at what you've done, and share different versions of our paintings and have a discussion down in the exercise panel. Awesome guys, have fun, keep going and take breaks as much as you can. It's all about layering and enjoy the process. Awesome.